My purpose for this week's question and video is to serve as a reminder to always double check your data. And what I mean by that is make sure that it is being processed and saved correctly. Whether we're building new functionality or fixing a bug, it's always important to remember that our code has no idea what we are expecting it to do. Our code only knows what we have written. And what I mean by that is code is exactly logical. It's not going to do something that we expect or hope it would do. It's only going to do what we have written, exactly what we have written, no more, no less. And granted, that can at times be very confusing because we think we've written something a certain way, but it is working a completely different way. And that is actually what stimulated this week's question, is a scenario kind of like that. Now, before we dig into that, as always, check out SwiftOtter.com and the resources that we have available there. Our purpose with creating those resources is to help you become a better developer and expand your knowledge and your expertise. Now let's take a look at the question. You are working on some updates to the checkout process for a client that requires some automatic changes to the shipping address based on which shipping method is selected. After creating the shipping method and adding a before plugin for the saveAddressInformation function in the ShippingInformationManagementInterface that overrides the current shipping address with one defined in store configuration, you notice that there are several server and front-end errors when the address is supposed to switch. After further investigation, you find that there are multiple rows being saved to quote address per quote ID for the shipping address type. Now, this is basically a summary of a bug that I was recently working on. We had a client that wanted a couple shipping options that, when selected, would automatically switch the shipping address. It was kind of like a pickup location kind of setup, and there were several errors showing up when selecting those specific shipping methods when that different address was supposed to be automatically generated in that field. Now, my first step was to debug the different errors and go through the flow of that shipping address change. But there was nothing really apparent when I was going through there. Everything seemed to be working correctly. The data looked to be correct. So I started looking into the data in the database and actually comparing it to a couple different areas that were working correctly and investigating what was showing up, making sure that I had a complete grasp of the situation. And that's what leads us into the possible options we have for the answers of this question. So what is likely the issue for the errors you are seeing? We have the three options, starting with option A. Further debugging is required as multiple shipping rows in the quote address table is expected functionality. B. The address ID is not getting set on the overridden address. And C, there is an issue with the shipping method itself, and it is causing Magento to save multiple rows for each address when the shipping method is selected. So starting with option A, looking at the quote address table, which I actually have a snippet of it here, for each quote ID, right here in this column, you can expect to see two rows in the quote address table. There's going to be one for the shipping type, and then there's going to be one for the billing type. And so when the customer checks the box to use the same address for both, there's going to be a flag that is set. I actually probably should have included that in the screenshot, but there is a flag that is saved in the database on the shipping address type, but there are still two rows. When you save that flag to use the same address for both billing and shipping, it doesn't merge those rows. There are still two. And so if the addresses are updated or a new one is created, the respective row, billing or shipping, gets updated. And again, there's no additional rows added. The existing rows are updated. The only variation to that would be if multi-shipping was set up. But from the info provided in the question, that is not the case. So we're going to mark option A as incorrect. There should only be two rows displaying in the quote address table for the quote ID. Moving on to option B, which again is the address ID is not getting set on the overridden address. This option looks promising. That would explain why multiple rows are being displayed if there is no address ID referenced, and yet it is still saved to the quote address table. That address ID is just going to be automatically created, saved to a new row. But let's also double check option C. There is an issue with the shipping method itself, and it is causing Magento to save multiple rows for each address when the shipping method is selected. Ultimately, the shipping method does not control saving the data to the quote address table. Granted, the question states that there is a plugin that is modifying and adjusting that data, overriding it in this case. It's still not being controlled by the shipping method. It's our plugin that's making that update based off of a trigger basically happening when that shipping method changes. But again, it's still pointing back ultimately to that data configuration, ultimately the plugin. So option C is also incorrect. So that leaves us with option B as our correct answer. The address ID is not getting set on the overridden address. And obviously we would need to take care of updating that plugin, making sure that the address ID is getting set correctly before that save. And in my case, since the address ID was not being set, the code did not realize that I was expecting it to magically save the address to the correct row, and so was creating additional rows every single time that shipping method was changed. So ultimately it was a very simple resolution. As soon as I made sure that what was written in the code base matched up with what was expected to happen, everything worked perfectly. So again, just a reminder to be aware of expectations and assumptions. They can be very dangerous when working with code, being that it is perfectly logical and sometimes we are not quite so much. Thanks for watching.